Hello, this is Brian Kinghorn and I'm going to talk to you about preparing your parameter files, and this is the second in the series. We're looking at the file InpOneGroup.txt, and just to remind you, for a basic minimum run you need a main data file, you need matecell.ini, and you need one of those two files, InpOneGroup.txt or InpGroups.txt. This depends on whether you're grouping. And just to remind you that grouping is where you decide which animals belong into which group. And here we've got a case with 3 different farms, and we do this separately for males and females. And in males there's an extra group here for artificial insemination, and in this case the target number of matings goes across farms. So this is where you decide which individuals belong to which group. There are 2 other features which resemble grouping in some way. Multiple end uses is where matecell decides which matings are going to be used to target which end group. And there is also something which is used by a number of groups whereby you cheat essentially and declare that an individual has a large number of matings required, so that a farm with 500 females might be represented in matecell as a single individual that requires 500 matings. And this is used for making decisions about dissemination as well as decisions about breeding in the breeding program. Now I'll remind you that matecell.ini is largely used for populating the user interface with default parameters, but that is not the case for the file InpOneGroup.txt, as these parameters are not represented on the interface. So this file is relevant to situations where you're not making separate groups within each sex. This is in order to make it simpler, because the InpGroups.txt file that we'll talk about in a later video is more complex, more involved, so we keep this separately for where there's no grouping, and it's 1 group per sex. So first of all, we can see that you can set the maximum number of backup sires reported per mating, and here the best 3 backup sires will be shown. We have a few lines for male and female pre-selection, and we'll discuss that in a moment. And then the rest of this file is for setting usage constraints, and we'll discuss that later. And you might be forgiven for thinking I look about a year older than just a moment ago, and that's because we have introduced a simpler and more powerful way of handling these usage constraints, and so that the rest of the video is quite new. So pre-selection, this is now only used in really massive jobs because matecell's speed of conversion is quite reasonable for relatively large populations. But if you want to reduce the number of candidates you've got by selecting on index alone, mind you, in this line here you can put a value below 1 for proportion, or as for females above 1 for number. So 0.6 means we've got a proportion of 0.6. The original number of male candidates in the data file is 40, and the best 24 of those are going to be selected for going into the analysis, 60% of 40. And here we're saying, because this is a number above 1, 80 is the number of females selected out of 108 on index to go into the analysis, and the analysis will run faster for having done that. But this would only be important if you've got a really large number of candidates. The numbers that you get down here, 24 and 80 in this case, can be not as I've described, because you may have AbsMinuse specified, which would keep these numbers higher perhaps, and the same for committed matings, where the number of matings totally is going to be higher because of matings that have been committed. So now we'll go on to look at the usage constraints. That's absolute minimum use, maximum use for males, and then again for females. So this is the pattern. The usage constraints, Maxuse is the maximum number of matings that an individual is allowed to have. Minuse is the minimum use that you must have for an individual, or 0 is possible. So for example, if you wanted bulls to have at least 20 cows to be mated in a natural mating situation, for example, 10 cows per bull, you wouldn't want that. Then set Minuse to 20, and then the legal number of matings for a male is either 0, not used, or 20 or above up to maximum use. Whereas absolute minuse, AbsMinuse, dictates that you must use these males for that certain amount, and 0 would not be an option in that case. So these are the 3 usage constraints we have for individuals. Now in the file InpOneGroup.txt you can put a -1. We'll see here we haven't got a -1, we've got a 25 for example for male Maxuse, but if you had put -1, that means that the usage constraints would be read from the main data file. So that Maxuse value in the main data file for each individual male, that would dictate their maximum use. However, if you have any other value, in the example we have here is 25, that means that all males that are candidates would have a maximum use as dictated in InpOneGroup.txt, which is 25 in our example. And this same rule applies for Minuse and AbsMinuse. So if you enter a -1 in the file, for example, a -1 here, that means that MateCell will look to the data file to get those values. Otherwise, it will use the value which is here, in this case 0 for each of these two minimum uses. And just 2 points here, the old way of handling this is still supported, and to point out that that is switched on in MateCell by not having a -1 in this particular line here. So using this line as it is supplied in MateCell, don't edit it to take out that -1. Otherwise, you would get the old way of reading in usage constraints, and you can read about that. It's still in the manual. And in all cases, if Maxuse is greater than 0 in the data file, that means that individual is a candidate for selection. So that if a Maxuse of 25 for a male, for example, is in the data file as a candidate, and that 25 Maxuse will be used if the InpOneGroup.txt file has a -1 for Maxuse for males. Otherwise, it will be overwritten by any other value that you put in that file. So let's move on to an example, and here's MateCell Classic Demo, and the 3 fields of importance are Maxuse, which is compulsory, and Minuse and AbsMinuse are optional. You can leave them out and control them within the InpOneGroup file. So it's the standard demo file, except for a couple of changes I've made. I've given Wayne Maxuse of 50, and I've given Jordy an absolute Minuse of 5 over here. So let's see what that does in a run, and I've made one. Here it is. When we look at the mating results by showing sire use, we can see that the maximum use for each of the sires is actually now 20, and the minimum use, Minuse, is 4, and the result is adhering to that. So why do we get these values? Well, that's because in the InpOneGroup file, I've made male Maxuse 20 and Minuse 4. And because neither of these values are -1, which is a switch to take the information from the data file, it means that these are the ones that are going to prevail. So just let's look again at that result. And for completeness, let's go to 90 degrees. When I look at that result there, you can see that what MateCell has done is spread as far as it can, the use over different sires. There's one sire that gets 6 matings, and that's Jordy, because his co-ancestry with the rest of the candidates is low. And ideally, we would spread even further and use more sires with less use each, but that doesn't fit the constraints that we've made. So let's now go and make a couple of changes. If we say we want Maxuse to be read from the data file, and the switch is to put a -1 in there, I'll switch off Minuse and do the same for AbsMinuse, -1 read from the data file. Save that, go back to MateCell, open our classic demo text file and make the run. And here are the results. Wayne is only being used 31 out of the possible 50 times, and we'll give him a chance in a moment. And you'll see that Jordy, who's got a very low index, is being used 5 times because we've said he has to be used at least 5 times. So let's give Wayne a better head and go for 0 degrees, which means that we're not too interested at all in diversity, and update these results. We can see that Wayne is not being used for the full 50 possible for him because we're looking for a total of 50 matings. He's not getting them all, and the reason is that Jordy still has to get the 5 that we have said he must get. So you can see that using -1, we can tell MateCell to read from the data file or use values in here, and we can do it globally. This also works across groups. For the next videos, we'll look at how that works in the grouping files. That's the end of this video. In this series, we've looked at constructing the main data file and constructing MateCell ini and this InpOneGroup.txt file. And our treatment of InpGroups.txt will go over 2 videos with standard features and advanced features. That's the end of this video. Thank you for listening.